So I thought we'd start, Gary, I thought we'd start with dreaming with Debbie Harry. I didn't want to say sleeping with Debbie Harry, but dreaming with Debbie Harry at least, and dreaming with Blondie. I thought we'd go all the way back to the beginning.
Well, I wouldn't say with either of the two. Well, close proximity.
That's right.
No, I think what Maitreyabandhu is referring to is long time ago, probably when you were just little gleams in your parents' eyes, perhaps. Maybe not all that. But I played in a rock and roll band called Blondie, and while I was living with Debbie Harry and Chris Stein, they were a couple at the time, in what was known as the Blondie Loft on the Bowery in New York. And this was when the Bowery was the Bowery. If you go there now, forget about the rents. You can't afford the cappuccinos or anything like that. No, it's completely gentrified. But back then, it was a real, wild place, no man's land and all that in the mid-'70s. And where we lived in this loft, the fellow who rented the place to us, there was 3 floors. It was totally illegal. And but he was this wild, gay biker artist who was into the Hells Angels, but also into Aleister Crowley, the notorious dark magician, whom the Beatles put on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's. That's how he was rediscovered in the late 60s and has since been a pop icon. I hate the word, but have to use it. And he was into Aleister Crowley, and I had no interest in magic, occult, anything like that, but he used to do these impromptu readings in the tarot cards. And then he would read from Crowley's novel, Diary of a Drug Fiend. And I wasn't interested in drugs at all at the time. But I read the book, and I found out all about them. No, it was a popular book, everyone was reading it, so I got really interested in this sort of thing. But the other thing was, another book that I read at that time was simply called The Occult. And this is by a British writer named Colin Wilson, who passed away 2013. And this was a fantastic history of, and I didn't know at the time, but Wilson had a whole 15-year history of writing about existentialism and phenomenology. I couldn't even pronounce it at the time, but this is what he was writing about. So he brought this sort of focus to the occult, and it was a fantastic page turner about all these sorts of people that I subsequently wound up writing about. But the dreaming thing was that the first Blondie tour, we were the support band for Iggy Pop, and at the time David Bowie was playing in Iggy's band. He was incognito keyboardist, and he had resurrected Iggy. Iggy had sort of bottomed out, and David had sort of got him going again. And while I was on tour, my girlfriend was back in New York, Lisa Jane Persky, who's at the time was a photographer, a journalist, and she subsequently was an actress in quite a few films, When Harry Met Sally and things like that in the 80s and 90s. In any case, this was well before the internet, well before mobile phones. So if you wanted to call each other, you had to sort of be someplace at some time. It was like time was much more of a constraint than it is now. And we've discovered that whenever each of us wanted to call the other was just about to call the other. Or we had the same sorts of dreams. And so because of being introduced to magic and the occult by this fellow about Crowley and then Colin Wilson's books, I just started to read everything I could about all this sort of stuff. And it was a good time to do this in New York because lots of bookshops had cutout bins with all this stuff that was public domain that was being republished and at cheap prices because they didn't have to pay the authors, they were all dead. So it was a fantastic time, and I just lapped up everything I could. And I just started thinking about this experience we had, and so I wrote a song. And the song was called I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear. And it was about these shared dream experiences. And it became a big hit for Blondie in 1978. We were 5 years old at the time. My girlfriend and I, no, sorry, that's a bad joke. But what happened after that was that I got very interested in dreams, and I read a book called An Experiment with Time by a fellow named J.W. Dunn, who was an aeronautics engineer. This was written in the 1920s, and just by chance, by accident, he discovered that in his dreams, he was seeing bits and pieces of his future ahead of time. It wasn't as if he was looking over the great horizon of the future and I predict. It was all little bits of what was going to happen to him turning up ahead of time. So what he saw in the newspaper, what he would see walking down the street, what somebody would say to him. He basically said, this happens to everybody, but we just don't notice it. So if you want to see if it's true, just write your dreams down. So I started doing that. So I began this book. And lo and behold, as soon as I started doing it, this stuff works. The very first future dream I had was about playing a red guitar. This is when I was a musician. I didn't have a red guitar. It was a red Fender Stratocaster, the details. I didn't have one. Nobody I knew had one. But meeting up with a friend, walking around in the East Village in New York, you meet somebody else, you wound up someplace you didn't know before, someone's place, and someone hands you a guitar and says, hey, check this out. And it was a red Fender Stratocaster. This is the dream. And then a much more intense and convincing one was about my dreaming about being in a rather intimate situation with a girl at the time that I hadn't been yet. But pretty soon, right after that dream, I found myself, and this is good, this stuff works. Really good. So I just continued to write my dreams down. And I wound up writing the book, just to give you some context, that just before COVID, I gave a talk at Brompton Cemetery on hypnagogia, which is this in-between state, sleeping and waking. Hypnos is a Greek word meaning sleep, gogia is the guide, the guide that takes you down into the underworld. But as you're falling asleep, you're in both places, and you can watch your dreams take place, and they're often very, very vivid, or you hear voices. But it's also a state in which precognition events can happen, precognitive dreams. In fact, the fellow Dunn, who wrote that book, some of the first ones he had were about that. So at the end of this talk, I tacked on some accounts of precognitive dreams, some of my own, some other ones. And the next day when I went on, what is it, Twixter now? What is it now? Twitter back then. Things changed so quickly. The first thing I went on was the first tweet I saw was someone who had been at the talk. And it was OMG, exclamation point, it works! I don't know how she managed to get this into one tweet, but it was like, I went to this talk, the guy said, if I want to see if I have precognitive dreams, write my dreams down. And I did, and she dreamt she dreamt that she had walked out her door, and she saw a hedgehog in the road. And she picked the poor thing up, keep it safe, picked it up and put it in the bushes. And when she went on Twitter, the first thing she saw in her feed was a post about how to protect the hedgehogs. Not exactly the same, pretty close. And I said, well, what happens in these dreams is they're often subject to what I call symbolic distortion, because the dreams speak a symbolic language. Although, often enough, it's spot on. The dreamed event and the actual event are exactly the same, and I have one or two like that in there. But often they're subject to a kind of slight metaphoring, a metaphor that was in there, but it's close enough. So she dreamt that she saved the hedgehog, and the first thing she saw in her Twitter feed was how to do that. So it was close enough for me. So I just pitched the idea to my publisher, and lo and behold.
Right. So I wanted to sort of really focus on dreaming ahead of time and precognitive dreams and precognition generally. Especially what I want to be doing is try to explore a bit about what that could mean about consciousness. But I thought we'd start with just the fact of dreaming. One of the things that you do in the book is that you sort of step us back and think about the very fact of dreaming and how evolution even has sort of protected us so that we can dream. I thought we might just start with the sort of larger context of dreaming itself.
Well, that's an interesting point, because one of the things that led me to become interested in hypnagogia is that it hasn't happened that often to me, but I used to be quite subject to sleep paralysis. I don't know if this happens to you. All right, so it happened to me if I would fall asleep on my back. And I would wake up, but my recalcitrant body was still asleep. And you're like this, and you can't move. And suddenly, you do that, and you. So this would happen to me often, and I thought this was some weird thing of some neurological disease I had, and I didn't know this is the end of end of a brief career and all that sort of thing. But I subsequently started reading everything I could about sleep and all that, and I discovered that this is fairly common. And the reason it's common is because way back in time in our evolutionary history, evolution, I have to anthropomorphize it, there's no other way to talk about it, or whatever is responsible, decided that it was better to save dreams than get rid of them. And the reason for this is when animals, right, dream, and if you have dogs, they're moving around like this all the time, that kind of thing, their muscles are torpid. Because meaning their muscles go slack, right? They can't move. That's why in our dreams, if you get into a fight with somebody, you never can land a punch. It's like, you try to, and you can't do anything because you really can't move. You can't move like that. And the reason that happens is that a long time ago, evolution, whatever's responsible for it, decided, well, we have to do two things here. We have a choice here. Okay, we have these animals, they're starting to dream, but they're moving around at night when they're dreaming, and they're attracting predators, right? They attract the predator, they're asleep, they can't really run away, they're just blah, 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 stuff like that, the thing comes and eats them. All right, so what do? Let's get rid of dreaming. That seems to be the easiest choice, because that's causing the problem in the first place. You're moving around and you can't really, get away from a predator. So this is a bad design fault. Let's get rid of that. No, let's save dreaming and make the muscles go slack so that you can dream and not attract the predator. So at some point, that decision, again, we can't avoid speaking anthropomorphically about that, was made so that, unless somebody's going to say just by chance, just by chance. There were a lot of animals that scurried around when they were dreaming, they were eaten, and then the other ones, just by chance, are just like that. They were fine and they bred and all that. That would be the mechanical kind of, neo-Darwinian, not necessarily real Darwin, because he didn't buy a lot of the mechanical stuff, but it seemed that evolution decided to save dreaming. So it seems an evolutionarily wanted phenomenon. So it's something dreams were saved for some reason. So that's an interesting thing in the first place, because you probably know most sort of standard, scientific or scientistic assessments of them is they're just kind of rubbish.
I mean, that's the basic scientific view. Yeah. As you say, scientific view, which is they're just the sort of trash of the day, and it just gets recycled at night, and then that's it.
Yeah, but I mean, it just doesn't stand up to. If you spend any time reading about dreams and history of dreams and people, in the different accounts of dreams and all that, it just doesn't stand up. Because you talked about skepticism about it and all that. Because, I mean, especially with precognitive dreams. I mean, the standard skeptical approach to this is like, well, if you dream often enough, you're bound to, oh, bing! Oh, the two things coincide. So that's often enough. So I'm saying I have a stack of journals like that, starting from 1980, all right? I condensed them to this. Accounting so many precognitive dreams. So it just is not, it can't be explained in terms of like chance, the number of things happening. So, and I experienced this personally. A few years ago I was doing the How the Light Gets In festival in Hay. And Rupert Sheldrake, who you had, last year, he was there. Ian McGilchrist was doing it, and some other people. And it was kind of like, that was sort of a theme, the kind of, what do we want to call it, spirituality, science, something like that. And I was paired up with a fellow named Michael Shermer, who's a scientist. And the theme, and there was another, I forget, there's an anthropologist and some other. And the theme was something about, is experience subjective, or is it shared? Is experience shared, or is it completely isolated? So in this room now, we all have a little pool of consciousness here, and it doesn't go beyond this. But somehow or other, we're able to feel that we're all together in the room. But although the standard view is consciousness keeps trying to get out of this, and it just can't do it. And I said, well, no, that's not true. I've had experiences of shared dreams, and that's what I just mentioned about that, and da-da-da-da. And, oh, Michael, well, I certainly can understand how you felt that you had experience of shit. And I said, no, Mike, I didn't feel. I felt the awe and wonder and mystery of the fact that once again, I had another shared dream experience. But it wasn't like, gee, that felt like a shared dream. No, it actually was. But then, as soon as that happened, the moderator cut it down. Just shut it down. Didn't want any kind of thing like that. And it's just sort of like, this, he must have, I don't know if he told the story, but when he tells, we're like, Richard Dawkins, like he doesn't want to see there is no evidence. I won't look through that telescope, which is what the churchman said to Galileo. How do I know that you have not put a demon inside the telescope to make me see these things like that? So I mean, that's about, the heavy weight of evidence, just statistics, shows that they just happen. Dean Radin is one of the leading scientists in the States who does this. And he has enough statistical evidence. If it was about anything other than precognition, no one would bat an eye at it. But because it's that, it's just...
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Rupert Sheldrake. We were in conversation not that long ago, and he makes the point that when we talk about the paranormal, the word paranormal means against the normal. And he was saying, actually, these things are ordinary. Everybody has them. So actually, they're very normal.
Yeah. Well, it goes by definition. I mean, the thing with precognitive dreams, I would say, if you bothered, I don't know, has anyone here had a precognitive dream in the room? We're among friends. Come on. All right, fine. So I think if you bother to pay attention and try and do it, you'll probably see. It all depends. And one of the interesting things, though, is they're usually about trivial things. The ones we hear about are what I call the 2 Ds. The disasters and the Derby, right? So you hear about 9/11. There's lots and lots and lots of evidence about all this precognitive material before 9/11 happened. From paintings, from things on album covers, from magazine covers, there's so much. It's just there.
You also talk about Abba Fan, don't you?
I'm sorry? Abba Fan, yeah. I mean, that's the other one. So,
particularly the girls.
And the other thing is you all hear the stories about the guy who dreams the winners, at Preakness or Aqueduct or whatever it is. But I would say the vast majority, the 95 at least % of precognitive dreams are about trivial events in the sense that they're about everyday events. And the only reason you pay attention to these dreams is like, why did I dream this about something happening in the future? Why that? I mean, there's a famous story about Charles Dickens, who had a dream about meeting some woman named Miss Napier. And he was just like, I don't know, Miss Napier. And then that day he was introduced to a Miss Napier. And this bothered him, like, why the heck did I have this dream about this person? It's like absolutely stupid. He was angry at his dream for having this. So, and it often is the case. So it raises the point, it's just, I'm not saying people don't have ones in which it's helpful. Susan B. Anthony, the early suffragette and feminist, she was staying in Atlantic City and she had a dream that the hotel was going to catch on fire the next day. So she left, and it did. So, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but if you look into the history of it, if you read accounts of it, there's a wonderful book by a woman named Catherine Crowe called The Night Sight of Nature in the mid-19th century, and this is before the Society of Psychical Research starts up. And she collected an enormous amount of anecdotal material about a wide variety of what we would call paranormal, spiritual, psychic, but precognitive. And even she says, she herself is sort of scratching her head like, well, one wonders why it's this sort of stuff that turns up. And it is an interesting question. So my theory about that is it's to make us, to elicit precisely the result it does. It's like, why the heck did I have that dream about? To make us to question time, to make us to question our ordinary acceptance of things.
I mean, even with that, those dreams of disasters and darbas, as you say in the book, even those are pretty remarkable, aren't they? The girl before Abba Fan who dreams about black sludge coming into the school and then going to school and dying. For instance.
No. I mean, there are some. And I forget. There actually. Think about synchronicities, which are closely related to precognitive dreams and things of that sort. At the same time that my book came out, the book precisely about, well, not precisely about Aberfan, but there was something called the Precognition Bureau. that was started up after Aberfan because a psychiatrist who was helping with the post, trauma of some of the people affected. He had interest in dreams, and he was curious to see if there were any sorts. And he did come up. And sadly, one of the most tragic ones is a little girl who the day before told her mother about seeing this black stuff coming down the hill, and she was one of the victims, and the school was completely engulfed with this slide. And with the idea of a kind of early warning system, could we possibly have that? So, but I don't think it was that successal.
And then, on the other side, there is actual stories about people who predicted Derby winners, isn't there?
Oh yeah. It happens. There's people who say, and there's a couple of main stories. There's people who they weren't punters themselves.
Right, yeah.
They weren't sort of betting themselves.
Right,
they just had it, and it's kind of like, and then they just mention it to their friends, and the friends, plunked a $5 down on something, and then tell me another one. And it went on, and eventually the guy, one of them, I can't remember his name right now, but he he became kind of like the racing columnist for, the Mail or something like that. And somebody else says, so you can do it, but it seems it's like for a brief time, so you get it, and then it goes away. And I know it myself as, against all my efforts, I grow older. I find that, it's not as often, but still it'll come up. And in my own experience, there have been some times when it has helped me personally. Because the most recent one, I had a dream in which there was an altercation in the dream with someone, just a kind of shouting match. And then I subsequently found myself in very much the same sort of thing with one of my neighbors. And about to say the unprintable, I realized, oh God, this is the dream. And so I was able to take a step back and walk away from it. So it can happen. That it's useful in your own life.
And I wonder whether it's worth, because also there's the phenomenon of precognition outside of dreams as well. My own teacher, Sangharakshita, had two very, very simple, and again rather banal. Like he had an experience of, he was working in an office, and he had an experience of someone coming in and talking to him that happened half an hour later.
Right, yeah.
And he had that 2 or 3 times around the same time.
Yeah.
Interestingly, whilst he was reading Schopenhauer.
Schopenhauer has a famous example.
Yeah, Schopenhauer had precognitive dreams.
Well, there's one famous example of him, or something about his, either he dreamed of like knocking over an ink well or something like that, and there were all these spots, or one of his servants did. I forget exactly the context, but Schopenhauer actually did have some ideas of like what we would subsequently call synchronicity, or Jung would call synchronicity, or the notion of fate, where somehow there is a kind of pattern that over time, you see things, and they have linked in a way that it seems, yes, inexorably this must have been the case. But Schopenhauer was very pessimistic. So, the funny thing about Schopenhauer, the Schopenhauer-Nietzsche thing, because Nietzsche started out as a devotee of Schopenhauer, and then he outgrew him, and he became a life affirmer, a yay-sayer, and Schopenhauer was, this kind of pessimistic life rejecter. But Schopenhauer had this wonderfully cozy life, he was like, well off, he ate well, he drank well, social life. Nietzsche had the most wretched life you could possibly imagine. The guy couldn't eat anything. He was constantly going over Europe trying to find some place where the climate was okay, had no friends, nobody read his books, may have had sex once in a brothel and got syphilis from it. But he became the yay-sayer. He became the one who proclaimed the doctrine of the eternal recurrence, that he would live the exact same life again.
Yes.
Not only under duress, but he would say, yes, encore. So, talk about strange kind of polarities between these two sorts of people.
But listen, before we go on to a bit more about precognitive dreams, I want to just make sure we're clear about the skeptical arguments, because one of my fears about anything, as soon as we get into the paranormal, there is you can get into a lot of cookie things fairly quickly. And there's a real concern not to lose genuine rationality. I don't mean, sort of silly rationality, hyper rationality, but the law of reason is still very, very important.
Yeah.
And also the other thing that always slightly bothers me is with anything around paranormal, it can slip into things like mental illness. Where actually is this sort of more like sort of mental health?
How long have you felt like this?
I'm not talking personally. I never remember my dreams, which is very disappointing.
I think the main skeptical argument is that these things can't happen. They're impossible.
Yeah,
that's it. They can't happen. So there must be some other kind of, and that to me seems irrational.
Yes,
because if you collect enough evidence over years and years and years and years, and it seems so it strikes me as irrational to avoid that. The scientific attitude is like, follow the evidence. As a child, humbly let it take you where it takes you. Not like, that can't be the case. So I think it's scientistic, which is a kind of religion or philosophy.
Yeah, sort of belief in science.
It's a dogma that says, the so-called scientific method is the only surefire way of arriving at any kind of truth or something like that. But the thing about the surefire scientific method is that it only works on things on which it is applicable to. There's many things that aren't. And this is one of those things, I would say. So, but I don't think it's necessary. It's not irrational, because it's not crazy in the sense of just wild. It's something that happens. It's not necessarily repeatable. Yes. And again, that's the other thing too. I think that's one of the problems with, and I don't want to sort of minimize the importance of the scientific investigation of that, but to try and repeat these sorts of things in a laboratory setting is not necessarily the best way. It's kind of like, sit there and love that music you're listening to.
Yes.
And let me just, and have a fantastic aesthetic experience right now, reading that poem, and let me put the electrodes up to you. It's like, it just doesn't work like that.
No, that's right.
So, and these things, they're not necessarily repeatable. They happen.
Yeah.
And I consider myself, if I have to call myself anything, a naturalist, or I would say a phenomenologist. I've learned how to pronounce it. In the sense that I try to describe, I pay attention to the phenomena, what's happening, describe it. Don't try to explain it. I have no interest in explaining why these things happen. They happen because the world is such that these things happen. That's the explanation for me. I'm going to describe them. So, you said earlier about what is consciousness. We all know what consciousness is. And any attempt to define it would make it only more mysterious and ambiguous. We all know. We know when we don't have it. We know when somebody else doesn't have it, But to say what it is, it's rather like, it's another mystery we talk about is time. Or St. Augustine says, what is time? If you don't ask me the question, I know the answer. So we all know what this is, but once you try to pin it down to anything explicit, that's what we're getting into left and right brain. Left brain wants an explicit, precise, repeatable answer to the thing, and the fundamental things that are most important to us in life cannot be answered in that way. You just can't. You can answer trivial things, how far is it from here to Jupiter or Mars? I guess Musk knows, right? Probably. I wish he would just get going. By all means, just go. Elon Musk conquers Mars. But it's sort of trivial. It's important in the sense that it allows us to do things, but it has no great sort of deep inner meaning or significance. Whereas the things that do, we understand them implicitly, not explicitly. You can't say exactly what it is. You can allude to it. You can point to it. You can suggest it. You can try to elicit the same feeling in another about it and that sort of thing. So I don't like what is consciousness questions. I like how is consciousness. How is your consciousnness? What's it like? How do you feel right now? Are you slipping into a hypnagogic state after listening to me now for a very long time and you're feeling sleepy? That's what I mean. So it's more how than what is.
I suppose you need both modes, don't you? You need, You need you need a genuine rationality, not a irrational.
Yes,
thing.
Absolutely.
And you need to be open to experiences, as you said, that just can't easily be tested. You couldn't test. There's been a lot of experiments on people meditating, and one of the reasons for that is because they're sitting still.
Yes, yes.
You don't do lots of experiments on people climbing mountains and what that feels like, or listening to Wagner and what that feels like.
Well, listening to Wagner, you climb the mountains without having to climb the mountains.
Yes,
that's the thing.
That's right. But we'll have a cup of tea in a minute, but I want to just, because in the second half I want to particularly try and, I'm interested in your idea, let's talk about how consciousness is rather than what, because what questions, like why questions, are rather problematic. But it'd be good to, in the second half, think about what it could mean in terms of things like time and free will, for instance, but especially in terms of consciousness. But before that, what was I going to say? Is there anything more to say about the apparent banality of precognition generally? Like in Bhante Sangharaj's, my teacher's experience, it really just was exactly what would happen in half an hour's time, which was a very inconspicuous, I need to bring you this. So, it wasn't anything of any import. Yeah. And he had about 3 experiences of that very, very vividly. He'd just relived the whole thing. And people's precognitive dreams seem of that kind, don't they? Mostly, as you say, they're mostly banal, really.
I say the ones we generally hear about are the more dramatic sorts of ones. But if you spend time reading, different accounts, there's lots of stuff. It generally is something that's. Oh, I dreamt there was I can't remember the exact context. There's some in this collection by this woman, Catherine Crowe. Is a family gathering, and the mother is telling a story to her children at the table, and they're laughing because she dreamt that there was a pig in the kitchen, and then, hey, Ma! Oh, there's a pig in the kitchen. So so it's like it's stuff like that. So maybe a Jungian might sit you down and say, the pig in the kitchen. What is the archetypal example? It may. I don't know. I mean, I've had this conversation. They say no dream is trivial. Okay, every day. Okay, let's not. Trivial, I guess, would be a value judgment in our use, but every day is not, right? Every day. So you get on the bus, the same bus every day, right? So that kind of. So it's everyday sort of thing. It just statistically is the case. It just is the case. Why is it the case? I don't know. Maybe it's just a glitch. I mean, and every future thing that's going to happen to us is not necessarily a big dramatic thing, with sunrise over the mountaintop or something. It's just, it's likewise with the notion of free will. Everything that's going to happen, we think about precognition, say, what does it mean about free will? So everything is laid out and determined. Well, maybe something should happen. It doesn't necessarily mean because you've dreamt something you have to change it happening. It depends. Some things do. There's the famous story, J.B. Priestley, who's a British writer nobody reads anymore. I've made a career out of writing about British writers nobody reads anymore. Colin Wilson, Arthur Koestler, J.B. Priestley's another one. But he has a fantastic book called Man in Time. It came out in the mid-'60s. And prior to the fellow who did the thing with the Precognition Bureau, with Aberfan, he put an ad out, I guess in newspapers or something at the time, and he asked people for, any accounts of precognitive dreams, because then he did a radio broadcast about this. And the number that he got was enormous. But he tells a story of a woman who dreamt that she was camping, with some friends by a river, and she had to wash some things, and she had a young baby with her. And so she took the baby and the things that she needed to wash from the tent down to the river, but she forgot the soap. So she says, I'll just lay the baby down here, be perfectly safe, I'll be back, 2 seconds. She runs back, this is all in the dream, runs back to get the soap, comes back, the baby is tumbled over into the river and has drowned. Sometime later, I forget the exact lapse between the dream and the actual event, she is camping. She does have her child. She does need to wash some things. There is a river. She's about to go. She remembers the dream. She remembers the soap. So she changed the future. Now, a strict literalist would say, well, it's not a precognitive dream because the baby didn't drown. I'm not so austere in the criteria for proof that I need a drowned baby. This was an example of what Priestley would say, well, I have to backtrack a bit. Dunn, in trying to explain, experiment with time, trying to explain the phenomena, he developed a whole philosophy of time. It's called serialism, which is basically, this time one, the time we're in now, one damn thing after the other. Going that way. Past behind us, future there. Time two, in our dreams, are up above that. And you can see both. Here's the future. and there's the past. And they mingle and mix in the dreams. And if you don't write your dreams down, you'll never know that you have a bit of the future in there. Because you don't pay attention to your dreams anyway most of the time. We're not taught to pay attention to our dreams, so you won't notice it. But then I won't stand on the chair because I'll probably fall over. There's time 3, which is up above time 1 and time 2, in which you can act. You can act. You can affect the future. You can change in some way, and that kind of thing. So where Don keeps going, infinite regress of different times, and you have to, it's kind of, you arrive at the Aristotelian, unmoved mover. There's eventually, just to stop, the horror of infinite regress, which is this is called metaphysical horror, infinite regress. There's no end to it. It's turtles all the way down, ma'am, if you know that story. So he just said, we don't need all of that. We just need 3 times. We just need 3 levels of time. And again, it's metaphoric, but whether ontologically there's 3 levels of time, whether there's anything really called time anyway. Is there anything called time? You talk about time travel. How long does it take to travel in time? Right? If it takes 10 minutes to get from now to 10,000 AD, well, that's 2 times because it took me 10 minutes to get there, right? So I have to travel in that time. You know what I'm saying? So, and another thing about time travel, if it ever was true, possible, it always was, right? Because you can travel in time. If they figured out how to do it in the future, they go back in the past. And time travel was possible in the past, wasn't it? So if it ever was possible, it always was. And I think it's not. This is what I call, Netflix science. All these like devs and dark, all the loop things. There's two series that are good. Or seasons, there's 2 seasons that are good, then the writers forget, they have no idea what to do anymore. Because there's too many time loops and they don't know what to do. There's 2 seasons are good, but that's the whole thing. It's Netflix science. There's no such, you cannot, forget the positrons, forget all the quantum guys say. There's no such thing as physical time travel. There's mental time travel. And this was something that H.G. Wells, who invented time travel, the time machine, said himself, the very first book, The Time Traveler, he doesn't even have a name. He's just an abstract figure. He has a machine that enables him to move to the 4th dimension, right? That was said to be. There's 3 dimensions, and then the 4th dimension is time. But then he read Dunn's book, and they became friends. Priestley, who also wrote plays based on Dunn's ideas, Time in the Conways, things like that, all sort of weird, time twist kind of things. He became friends with Dunn as well. And Wells' later time travel book called The Shape of Things to Come. This is the future history. And there's a fellow in it who's read Dunn's book. One of the characters in the thing has read Dunn's book, and he's recorded his dreams of the future. So it's not a physical, getting a machine and go there. Mentally you can do that. So I think mentally we can do that. We do it in precognitive dreams. I think mentally you can go into the past as well. I have accounts there, what we can call time slips, when the past becomes as real to you as the present. In literature, the famous one is Proust at the Madeleine, if you know the beginning of Remembrance of Things Past. It has a little cake, and it's dipped in a tisson, and he tastes it, and suddenly he's reminded of something. He can't remember what it was, and it was his childhood when he visited his aunt or his grandmother in Cambrai, and she used to give him this kind of thing. And he says, I no longer felt contingent, mortal, and he just suddenly felt outside of time. So he knew, as a fact, that that's where he spent his holidays. If you asked him, Marcel, where did you spend your holidays when you were 9 years old? Oh, yeah. He knew. See, this is another thing, language breaks down for us. We have 2 ways of knowing, and we only have 1 language to talk about them. So it's what I call knowing in italics. There's knowing and then knowing in italics, or knowing in quotation marks. So he knew that that's where he spent his holidays. But when he tasted that cake, he really knew. It all came back to him. So he didn't physically leave where he was and go back in the past, but mentally he did. And there's even a more powerful example, and this is one of the ones I got from Colin Wilson in this book, The Occult, I read years and years ago. The historian Arnold Toynbee. If you ever decide to go to the deserted island I suggest take a copy of Arnold Toynbee's A Study of History. It's like that. It'll keep you occupied for some time. But in one of the books, he tells about how he came to write this book. And it's a study of civilizations, like 20 civilizations over from going back to the beginning to, well, he died in 75. And it's a quote I put up recently, but he says, out of the 19 civilizations I've studied, all of them have collapsed and they've reached the state of moral decline that the United States has now arrived at. This is what he said in 1975. So 50 years later, I think it's more apt. But he tells about he's in Greece, overlooking the ruins of a city called Mistra, which at one point was a very important kind of trade route city, but in the early 1800s it was overrun by wild Highlanders who just completely destroyed it, and it's been a ruin ever since. And he's there, it's like 1912 or something when he's there, so it's a while ago. And he's chewing a chocolate bar. And he's looking out over the plain, of the destroyed city and all that. And suddenly he's back at the moment when the Highlanders have come over the hill. And everything around him is like, he's there in it, and he's like seeing it around. So it's a combination of his knowledge, he knew what had happened there, plus he was very relaxed, he was in the place, actually physically in the location where it took place, and his imagination just put all those things together, and he was there. And you might say, oh well, Toynbee's on vacation, he's relaxed, he's having a chocolate bar, it's wonderful, he's in Greece, so that kind of thing happens. But he had an even more powerful experience like that by Victoria Station, of all places, which that strikes me as like one of the least mystical places you could possibly think of, And he was walking, I forget which avenue it is, along one side of it, and he said he had a vision of the vast panorama of history, of all of history. And this led to him writing this thing of all history. So this is a long-winded way of saying that we do have the imaginative capacity to go and, not in some science fiction-y kind of way, but to really go back into the past. And it might very well be the way, because Toynbee himself says that he noticed things in these experiences that he hadn't read about. There was like a group of horsemen somewhere. He said, oh, who are they? So you get a feeling maybe he saw something, so in any case, so...
Obviously, I'm thinking of this from a Buddhist perspective, which is that what precognitive dreams suggest, and what the experience of precognition, like my own teacher, Sangharakshita, I know him, very well. I trust his word very deeply. I've never known him tell things that aren't true, especially that. Why would you bother? He simply wouldn't do that. So I have to accept that something's going on in all that. And as you say, there's lots and lots of evidence. And also, as you say, that famous story that Rupert Sheldrake told me where, he was talking to Dawkins about, I think it was about people, telepathy, which is, again, there's lots of evidence for telepathy. And Dawkins said, well, I don't want to look at the evidence, and as soon as you don't want to look at the evidence, you're not in science, you're somewhere else,
Absolutely.
But so what that suggests for me as a Buddhist is that, yes, consciousness is much more, whatever's happening to us now in this very moment is much more mysterious than we can possibly know. That science, I think, is important, and we could hardly imagine life without science and technology. So we mustn't kind of get into that sort of silly anti-science because, just think of going to the dentist. You definitely want them to be good on science. You don't want to say that you don't need them to ask you how your dreams are getting on. You just want, really get them to be good on science. So you can go wrong in both ways, I think.
Sure.
But certainly it suggests there is more to consciousness than we know. That must be ineluctable now. And the whole Buddhist project really is to say, yes, that's true, and you can move towards a transcendental consciousness in which you can live from a transcendental place. In a way, you do it a bit like your serialism, but from the greatest possible perspective. And that's what the Buddha figure represents, a kind of living from, and for us, an unimaginable place of consciousness, which is beyond secular on one hand, which, I think the secular, there's problems there, but it's also beyond God on another hand. I just wonder where you would sit in relation to that kind of thought. Because Buddhism would say, yes, this is all Buddhism is full of these kind of stories, and the Buddha himself, there's lots of stories about devas, which are sort of angels and mud spirits, and he experienced the world as alive and conscious, and that consciousness is even primary in Buddhism. But the project of Buddhism is about, let's actually take up practices that actually take us towards that insight into consciousness. What would be your approach?
Well, we touched briefly, and earlier before the evening started, we were just sitting together out there. I mentioned earlier this British writer Colin Wilson, and I guess I would say, my approach has been very, very much influenced by his ideas.
And you knew him, didn't you?
Sorry?
You knew him?
Oh, yeah, yes, I met him. Well, I first read his book, The Occult, 50 years ago when I was living in his loft on the Bowery with Debbie, Harry, and Chris Stein, a block away from CBGB, the birthplace of punk rock, and the Ramones and all that kind of thing. So that was an incongruous, unlikely milieu in which I became introduced to this sort of thing. But, I met him. I went on a pilgrimage in 1983. He lived in Cornwall, a little place called Gorin Haven. And the biggest place was a slightly less little place called Mevagizzy. So it's down on the way to Penzance or St. Austell, if you know that neck of the woods. And he wound up going down there in 1957. Colin Wilson's first book was The Outsider. It came out in 1956. He had spent he was 24. He spent the previous 10 years learning how to write and affirming to himself, if to no one else, that he was a genius. And when his first book, The Outsider, came out, it was published, May 1956, it was an overnight success. So his confidence in himself was worthwhile. But he quickly became persona non grata with the press. He was he was identified with a gang called the Angry Young Men. The Kitchen Sink School, John Osborne, Look Back in Anger, Alan Silito, Kingsley Amos, people like that. You probably never read them, don't worry about it. It's okay. But his first book, The Outsider, is basically, he was hailed as Britain's homegrown existentialist, in the sense that he was writing about creative individuals who were faced with this challenge of trying to find meaning and purpose in increasingly secular and increasingly scientific world that was explained. And, so meaning and purpose, well, that's somehow, we can explain that in terms of, your biological drives. It's got nothing to do with anything spiritual. And these characters they wouldn't accept that. And Wilson was one of these characters himself. In any case, he wound up being hounded by the press, and he went down to Cornwall in 1957 and stayed down there. And I made a pilgrimage down there in 1983 when I was on what I subsequently called a mini search for the miraculous, which is, if you know Gurdjieff and Uspensky, that was like Uspensky's book about his time at Gurdjieff in Search of the Miraculous. And this meant in 1983, with a friend of mine, I was actually involved in the Gurdjieff work at this time. And we went to Glastonbury and Avebury and Stonehenge, and then in France we went to Chartres Cathedral. And I have to say, when I went inside Chartres, has anyone been there in the Chartres Cathedral? There's more space inside the cathedral than there is outside. You know what I mean? There's more space inside those vaulting, towering ceilings with the rose windows and all that, in the outside, outer space kind of thing. More mystical sort of space. So it had all that sort of stuff. But part of this mini search for miraculous was a solo pilgrimage of my own down to Cornwall to visit Wilson. That was 1983. And we started a friendship correspondence, which continued into 2013 when he died. And there was a service for him at St. James Piccadilly, over that neck of the woods. People like Rupert Sheldrake have spoken there, and others have spoken there. And I was given 5 minutes to sum up Colin Wilson's work. And the guy wrote like close to 200 books, and been writing for I don't know how many years. But he came to my rescue because in the very first book of his that I read, The Occult, he talks about what he calls the paradoxical nature of freedom. Right? When our freedom is threatened, We know exactly what it is, how important it is, and we will fight tooth and nail to secure it, right? But once we secure it, involuntarily, against our best wishes and efforts, we slowly take it for granted. And it no longer elicits the same kind of response in us until it is threatened again. So Joni Mitchell might not have been a great existential philosopher, but in her song she says, "You don't know what you got till it's gone," which is sums up the pretty much kind of thing. So Wilson spent a career saying, why does that happen? Why does it happen that something I will do everything I can, whatever you call it, freedom, value, whatever it is, the most important thing in your life, and I don't mean money. That's what it is. This ain't what we're talking about. Some non-physical, what the psychologist Abraham Maslow called meta-values, not deficiency values or deficiency needs.
That distinction is meta-values and deficiency.
Okay, well, there's Maslow, you might know, he has what he calls the hierarchy of needs. This is something he discovered. There's a human nature, in contradistinction to the standard scientific notion that there is no human nature. We are tabula rasa. We are blank slates. John Locke, there is nothing in the mind that has not got there by way of the senses, right? Right. So the mind, before you have any experience, is a blank slate, and then stuff happens to us. It's like our head is an empty flat until you go to IKEA, and you buy a lot of stuff, and you bring it there, then it's all furnished, right? So Locke's image, and just strangely enough, this formed the political basis of both the United States and later Soviet Russia, meaning environment is everything, not nature. There is no, they don't like human nature. It's this recalcitrant thing they have to deal with all the time because they want to mold it in order to make the perfect utopia or something like that. Okay. So Maslow said, no, there is a human nature. And it's structured in what he called the hierarchy of needs. So the basic need is for food. Well, air, right? But if you don't have that for 5 minutes, forget about everything else, right? So we have to start with food and drink, right? If you're hungry, that's the only thing you think about. Once you're fed, I'd like to have a nice little place of my own, right? So you have a little home of your own. Even the poor, sad, homeless people who have their tent up somewhere. That's their little patch, whatever it might be. And then once you have that and you secure that, you want some kind of connection, some kind of relationship. Emotional, sexual, but it could just be with a pet. It's just some kind of emotional relationship. The next level is self-esteem. You want the good opinion of everyone. And I believe culturally, we as a whole society are at that level now because we're all fighting for likes. How many people looked at my post on internet? So it's all this battle for self-esteem. I also think it's a strange version of what's known as the war of all against all, which presages the final battle, which Trump and his sidekick Vance are trying to get going over in the Holy Land. Sorry, that was a political statement. Shouldn't say that. But up above, those are all deficiency needs. They are things we lack. But Maslow said once we fulfill all those things, then a higher kind of need comes out, what he calls a being need or a meta need. It's a need not for something you lack, it's a need to make use of what you have. It's a need to be creative. It's a need to do something. Even if it means just collecting stamps or, whatever, some hobby. It's a need to do something creatively for its own value, not for its utilitarian value. All the deficiency needs are for utilitarian values, right? And this is for something else. And this is those higher levels. These are the sorts of things that Wilson was talking about in his philosophy, in all his books, and that kind of thing. And so why is it that this happens? Why is it that when our freedom or whatever our highest values are threatened, we know exactly what they are and we'll fight to the death to protect them? Why is it that invariably we lose grip? This is what he calls the indifference threshold. And he formulated it this way. He said there is a kind of state in human consciousness where pleasant things have no effect on us. You know how if somebody's grumpy in a really bad mood, no matter what good thing you say to them, it only makes them worse, right? If they are suddenly confronted with an inconvenience, a crisis, right, it will paradoxically cheer them up because they will have to deal with it and then they get out of the mood. And suddenly they wake up. Wilson came to this conclusion ages ago when he was a young man and he had to go on some duty visit to his girlfriend's parents in Peterborough. He was living here in London, so he was hitching. This is in post World War II, mid 1950s London. Duffel-coated, as they used to call it, duffel-coated bedsit, milk bar, London. So he's hitchhiking up to Peterborough. He doesn't want to go. There's nothing else he necessarily wants to do. So he's in a thoroughly nasty mood of resentment, and everything is horrible, right? And even when he gets the first ride from a guy in a lorry, that doesn't change. But when he's in that lorry, the engine starts making a problem, starts making a noise and that kind of thing, right? And the guy says, "Sorry, mate, I got to pull this in to the garage. I got to let you off here." So he basically said, he's out there, so right. He doesn't even cheer up when the second lorry stops for him. The second lorry stops for him, picks him up, takes him ride, and as synchronicity would have it, the same thing happens. Something in the engine kicks up again. He's like, fuck. But the driver says, hold on a sec, look, I think if I keep it to this speed, we can keep going, whatever it was. Because if I go past that speed, it starts to make... So you pay attention, right? You pay attention, I'll try to keep it, and if you start hearing it doing that, you let me know. So Wilson suddenly, he's intent, he's focused. His mind has become a fist, which is what, you have to make a fist with the mind. I'm doing him, that's what he did. And then the guy says, "Mate, I think we'll make it." He's ecstatic. Wow! I'm going to make it to Peterborough. Fantastic. Half hour earlier, he would have shot himself. He was so bloody bored with it. So what has happened? So this is what it happened. He calls it the St. Neots margin because it happened near a place called St. Neots on the way to Peterborough. But a less specific term is what he calls the indifference threshold. So he wasn't cheered up when he got the second lift, right, from the lorry, right? He wasn't cheered up then. It was a good thing that happened to him. Didn't get him out of his bad mood. What got him out of his bad mood? The fact that he was asked to focus and concentrate his mind to hear that. The focusing itself cheered him up. So the inconvenience or the crisis. I mean, another story Wilson tells all the time, and I'll just make this quick. The writer Graham Greene, right? Very dreary Catholic who writes how horrible life is and all this stuff that's going to happen. When he was a young man, he suffered horrible depression. And he went to the best doctors in Vienna. There was nothing they could do for him. That's an old joke. But there's an essay he wrote called "The Revolver in the Corner Cupboard." And his older brother, had a revolver. And Greene had been reading about Russians playing Russian roulette. And he saw the revolver. So he was so bored to tears, absolutely, completely, nothing got any kind of response out of him. Life is just horrible, everything is horrible. So he thought, yeah, I'm gonna go do this. So he takes the revolver, his brother has some ammunition, he puts a cartridge in. He goes on to Berkhamsted Common, spins the cylinder, puts the thing to his head, and pulls the trigger. And there's a click, empty chamber. Suddenly, everything became very interesting to Graham Greene. He wasn't bored anymore. And he says, around me, possibilities opened up and this kind of thing. So what happened? Did the world suddenly say, oh my God, we can't let Graham Greene blow his brains out. So when he does that, I'm going to make everything look fantastically interesting to convince him. No, it was like that to begin with. He was dull to it. But doing that, again, I'm doing a Colin, he made a fist with his mind. So the inconvenience in the lorry was a smaller version of that, but it was the same thing. It was a tightening, but it's the same thing, practicing meditation, concentration in some way. I mean, there's some outer event which elicits the concentration rather than you sitting down and doing it.
Yeah.
But that's it. But Wilson said from that, okay, crisis does this. Okay, if crisis does this, why does crisis do this? Because it makes us do that. Can we do that without the crisis? Okay, well, the philosopher Heidegger and also the esoteric teacher Gurdjieff said, the sure way, one sure method, surefire method to shake us out of our, what Gurdjieff called sleep, Heidegger called Seinvergessenheit. That's a really good German word, Seinvergessenheit. Forgetfulness of existence, forgetfulness of being, is the realization that we will die. Everyone in this room will be dead at some point. I plan to get around to it at some point. But everyone in this room, will die. I'm going to die at some point. We know that as a fact, but we don't know that in the way that Proust knew, what his holidays was like when he tasted the cornbread. So that's one way. So that's one way to use the imagination, right? You can make an artificial crisis in the sense of use your imagination to really grasp vividly the fact that you're going to die. Okay. Why is that bad? Because you will lose all the things that you love, right? So the next step, Wilson says, okay, well, rather than focusing on something really gloomy, like you're going to die, why don't you use your imagination to grasp the reality of the things you would lose? They're important to you, like your freedom. When your freedom's threatened, right? Suddenly becomes very important to you. Why? Because you would lose all those things. So use your imagination to grasp the fact that you would lose these things, if this happened. So that's the more positive kind of thing. And we have hundreds of reasons to be thankful every minute of our lives. I mean, that sounds like Oprah Winfrey or something, but it's true. I mean, sadly, it's true. But we lose track. We lose the grasp on them. This is the whole point. So our minds go flaccid. When you hold on to it, it's like, yes! And then, So we're mostly most of the time until the car almost, runs us over when we turn the corner or something like that. So can we use our minds, can we use our imagination to focus on that?
And is that what Wilson means by beyond the robot?
Yes, yes, exactly. Sorry, yes.
The outside, it's interesting. Again, this is a sort of connection between us. The outsider was very important, again, to my own teaching. It's very important to lots of people, that book, wasn't it?
Well, the robot is this, I don't know if I said the robot, we were talking about it. I don't know if I've said it in this context.
You haven't said it here.
The robot, why this happens to us, why we are subject to the indifference threshold, Wilson says, is because we have this very handy evolutionarily necessary adaptation that he calls the robot. And it's a kind of valet that does things for us, right? When you learn to type, it is horribly, agonizingly difficult. You have to pay attention to every little key, everything. Right. At one point, bang! Some other part of you takes that over, and then you can think about what you want to type. Right? When you learned how to ride a bike. Bang, bang, bang. At some point you can ride the bike. Then you can think about where you want to go on the bike. Likewise, you try to learn how to speak French. At some point, you're in Paris and you can actually ask directions and they don't look at you like, mad. So some part of us takes it over. We're not doing it consciously anymore. And at that point, when the other part of us, the handy, ever-useful valet takes it over, if we try to do it consciously, we screw it up, right? I mean, I was a musician for many years, and I remember the best times when I had no idea what I was doing. I was just playing. And once you start, think about it, you forget. I mean, a couple of years ago, for a few months, I wound up playing again, just for fun, with a Blondie cover band. Just for fun. I did a string. It was fun. And these guys had this tech that I just couldn't believe. They had tablets up there and all this stuff, and they would ask me stuff, and I said, I had no idea. We just did that. I remembered the songs. That's all. But it's just they had all this kind of tech, and so in order to be a musician, you have to develop something like that. And there's wonderful times, and Maslow talks about these as well, where one has what he called peak experiences, which you're not necessarily going out of your way to have some fantastic transformative experience. It's like some everyday thing, you suddenly see it for the first time. You suddenly see it as if you've never seen it before. And you have this overwhelming sudden moment of joy and happiness and delight in something that 5 seconds ago meant absolutely nothing to you. So, but he also talks about musicians who would say that at some point the music was playing them. And I had experiences like that when I was, but that's a wonderful cooperative, working between me, the conscious me, and the robot. They work together. But the problem with the robot, with most of the time, is that it does its job too well. And it starts doing things that we'd rather do ourselves. When I was a kid, there was you probably don't know this, a long time ago, there was a TV commercial for some aspirin, some like Anacin or something like that. And there was a young mother and a young wife and her mother over her, sort of trying to get stuff. I'd rather do it myself, mother. Pushing her away. That's the robot. We'd rather do these things ourselves, but it starts doing them for us. It starts listening to the music. It starts seeing the sunset. It starts, whatever. And the robot's job is to minimize on the amount of energy we use towards any kind of task. It's basically geared towards taking over repetitive tasks, right? So that it frees up our consciousness for something else. But what happens is that we get so used to it doing things. And this is the insidious part. We don't know this is happening. We think we're just, every day, this is just how it is. And I was saying to Maitreyabandhu about a book I have to start writing. It's due next year. But it's based on this experience I had during the first lockdown. And I have to admit, I have lockdown nostalgia. I know it's a horrible thing to say. It was a horrible time for people. But it was just, in some ways, it was, a time unlike any other in many ways. But one morning, I'm blessed with a garden that opens onto a communal garden. One morning, at the beginning of the lockdown, that was 5 years ago, it was March, wasn't it? And, so 5 years ago. I walked out, cup of coffee in hand, and I looked up and I said, "What's that?" And it was the sun. I was surprised by the sun. It was as if I'd never seen this big yellow ball up in the sky before. And for the nanosecond before everything I knew about the sun, it's 93 million miles away, boom, it takes 9 minutes for the light to reach us. It was like, I could feel it as a three-dimensional thing, and I could feel the space between myself and it, and suddenly, and how to say it, everything became real. Forget about HD, forget about virtual reality. This was real in some way that only happens to us a few times in our life. Maybe more if you're a Buddhist, I don't know. Maybe it happens to you more. Maybe that's the reason why you guys are all here and say, "Hey, Gary, check it out. This happens to us all the time." Maybe, I don't know. For me, it was something special. And I thought, and what had happened is because I was in a slight crisis mode, the lockdown was more of an inconvenience to me than anything else. But I was in a slight crisis mode. I was on my bike going to the smaller shops because the big shops didn't have anything. The only thing that was in the big Waitrose near where I live were matzah crackers. So you had to think things had not got that bad yet, right? Because they still left behind the matzah crackers. But it's like you had to go around to find stuff. So I'm cycling to little shops and all that kind of stuff. So it was slightly crisis kind of mode. So I was there a bit more than the robot was there. So Wilson says most of the time we're like 49% me and 51% robot. But then I was more 50% me, maybe even 51, maybe that moment when I was surprised by the sun, I was 51% me and 49% robot. But the robot's not a villain. We need the robot. If we didn't have a robot, you'd have to learn how to tie your shoes again. I still have problems with that. So we need to, we need this kind of thing, but it does its job too well. And Wilson devised the whole, I think the first thing, you talked about, not just an idea thing, but I think it's important to have ideas. I think it's important to understand this he worked his way through this, step by step. This is this. Why does Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, feel more free than ever before when he was in Paris and in danger of being arrested by the Gestapo? why do so many, not too many alive anymore, but there used to be all these accounts from Brits who, the Blitz was the best time of their life. You know, because somehow they felt more alive. Gurdjieff, the enigmatic Armenian Greek esoteric teacher, was a master of artificial inconvenience, induced crisis. He would create these situations where his students had no idea what was going on. They hadn't the slightest idea. Is this guy pulling my leg? Am I getting ripped off? What the heck's going on here? But they never felt more alive. So can we create a methodology or something? And I think you need to have an idea in the first place. You need to know, okay, this is, you can see, yes, I remember when I tried to learn how to type. It was agonizing. I don't have to do that now. Some other part of me does that. Oh, okay, that's a real phenomenon. This is what the philosopher Michael Pogliani called tacit knowing. Is a knowing that you can't speak about. You know, we know more than we can say. Like earlier I said, St. Augustine, if you don't ask me what time is, I know the answer.
Yeah, that's striking, because it reminds me of a friend of mine a long time ago went to talk to our teacher, Sangharakshita, and said, look, I really, really want to be like you. How do I get to be like you? And Bhante Sangharakshita said, reflect on everything that happens to you. He didn't say be good, he just said reflect on everything that happens to you.
Yes.
And in a way, what you've been saying this evening is something like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
I have these dreams that seem that then seem precognition. I reflect on what that is. And
pay attention to your experience. Because that's what you got. That's what you got. This is what you're given. You're given insights through your experience. You read a lot, that gives you the context to try to understand the experiences, but that's what you have. And this philosophical methodology, phenomenology, which I've mentioned already, it's a descriptive account of what is given. So what's given in consciousness? In a way, it's like if you look at something, don't tell me what it is, tell me what you see. Right? So if you look at a tree, that's a tree. No, you're telling me what it is. That's a concept. That's not your perception, that's not your experience. So it's difficult. And in Buddhism, there must be some degree like that too, because there's all the concepts, we see things, we see them through this. And again, the concepts are necessary. If we don't have them, the world is just this blooming, buzzing confusion, as William James said many years ago. So it's just, we have to order things into a certain kind of, conceptual way we can manipulate. That's what the left brain does. But we tend to confuse that conceptual system that enables us to navigate through life for the thing itself, and we lose track of the other. That's why we're surprised by the sun.
It's striking, isn't it? Because Wilson and yourself saying something again that Buddhism would say, which is that the whole matter is more life. What you're given is life, whatever that means.
Life more abundant.
Bhante once said, Sangharakshita once said, if you don't like the language of the transcendental, just talk in terms of more life. Not more activities, more money, more belongings, but more life. Like what you're saying about those experiences of Colin Wilson, there are experiences on there of more suddenly experiencing more life.
Well, I said it's or more being, or you feel your being again, which is not. It isn't good for anything. That's the thing. It's not utilitarian. It's a good in itself, and that's another thing I think in the West we've lost track of, the notion of something being a good in itself. We talk it's good for something, but something being good in itself is like we don't, whatever Dawkins or these other guys. We have to explain this in terms of evolutionary adaptation or something like that, and it's just like they want to avoid the notion, and again because it leads you to value judgments. It leads you to what do they call it? Normative sorts of statements. So a lot of people don't like Maslow because he basically sets a standard. This is what a healthy human being is. And if you don't, not a sense of don't meet that standard, but somehow he talks about being fully human. Right? There's only human. And there's fully human. We tend to say, well, I'm only human. I'm only human. Don't expect too much from me. But no, Maslow's saying, well, you're cutting out you're cutting out your creativity, you're cutting out what's most important to you. Be fully human. And he even says, if you have talents, if you have abilities, and if you don't nurture them and use them, they'll sour. They'll become... And William Blake said this ages ago, he who desires and acts not breeds pestilence. Sooner murder an infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desires. That's pretty rough, I know. But it's the whole, and the Gnostics, the ancient Gnostics, the Gospel of Thomas, this is something that Jung drew on a lot. If you bring forth what is within you will save you. But if you do not bring forth what is within you will destroy you. So, I mean, the scientific standard of some kind of well-adjusted person to what? Well-adjusted to a crazy society?
Yeah.
No, and the whole point that there is no end limit to the development. So Maslow, it's open-ended. It's not as if, like, okay, you're happy, you have enough sex, you have enough money, you have a nice home and all that. Isn't it wonderful? No, we human beings are subject to this horrible cussedness in the sense that they want something more than any of that. They are not happy just with comfort and stuff like that. That may seem counterintuitive. We have this comfort society and all that, but I think basically we're not happy with that. There's a wonderful story by a Russian novelist, Brusov, called The Republic of the Southern Star. And this predates Huxley, it predates Orwell. It even predates Yevgeny Zamyatin's We. I don't know if you know that one, 1924. Brusov is writing 1905. And it's about a utopian society in the Antarctic where everything is perfect. Everyone's very happy. They live in similar houses. They wear similar clothes. They eat similar food. Free sex. Everything's fine. And then some weird thing breaks out, what's called contradiction mania breaks out, where someone really wants to say yes, they say no. If they like something, they'll throw it against the wall. I don't know if anyone's old enough to remember the old Superman comics where there was Bizarro World. Remember Bizarro World? It's the one planet in the universe which is square. It's not a round, it's a square planet. And, if you love someone, you give them a lump of coal. If you hate them, you give them diamonds. It's the opposite. And this is what happens in this Republic of the Southern Cross, where contradiction mania breaks out. And this is really a gloss, if you know your Russian literature, on Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. The beetle man, the man who lives under the floorboards, right? And he feels completely alienated from this new society coming up. This is 1860s, the new scientific society, where everything is understood and explained. And he knows he's not strong, he's not powerful, he can't do anything. But he says, I will go insane on purpose to show that I'm something more than a cog in a wheel. So that's what happens to this society. The whole society goes insane on purpose. And it's basically saying that no matter how perfect in terms of utilitarian aims and goals society you create, there's still something else there that cannot be satisfied by that. Religion used to do it, but I would say most, again, I'm not denying people, who are participants in the major religions today still experiencing that. But overall, it doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem to be something that, works overall. So Brusov didn't have an answer to that, but that's the problem. What do we have to give our lives meaning when all the things that we suspected that were supposed to be, what we needed, creature comforts, all that kind of stuff. And everyone should have a wonderful home. Everyone should have, all that. There's nothing wrong with, of course we should have all that kind of stuff. But once you do that, there still remains the problem, these existential questions, what do I do now? Why do I exist? Why am I here? That's the tough one, I'm still working on it. I've been at it for 50 years now.
So that might be a great place to finish. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.